On the 25th of April 1980, a Boeing 727 passenger jet flew off course in thick fog and crashed into a mountainside in Tenerife, killing all 146 passengers and crew aboard. The disaster could have been averted if not for the absence of a single letter in a word. The plane was owned and operated by Dan Air, a unique airline that would do anything: chartered flights, scheduled passenger flights, cargo flights, Royal Mail flights, you name it. The airline had a wide range of planes, including the 727, becoming the first British operator to fly it. Throughout Europe, the tourism industry had long relied on package deals called inclusive tours, where you bought the plane ticket, hotel stay, and holiday activities from a single tour operator. One such flight was operated by Dan Air as it took off from Manchester Airport in England on April 25, 1980, en route to Tenerife and the Canary Islands. On board were 138 passengers, mostly British tourists looking forward to enjoying Tenerife's beaches, mountains, and volcanic landscapes. Their destination was Tenerife North Airport, formerly known as Los Rodeos. Just 3 years earlier, the airport had been the scene of the deadliest plane crash in history, when two Boeing 747s collided on the runway in thick fog, killing 583 people. One of the main factors that led to the disaster 3 years prior was again present on April 25, 1980. Fog. It would frequently form around the high mountain peaks, then roll across the airfield, situated at over 2,000 feet, 600 meters, above sea level. The mountains were covered in so much fog that meteorological stations reported zero visibility. To make matters worse, the Boeing 727 was rapidly gaining on a smaller turboprop plane ahead. Tenerife Airport, just like 1977, did not yet have radar, so air traffic control relied on pilots to relay their aircraft's position. The air traffic controller on duty that day soon realized that the Boeing was getting too close to the smaller plane, so he ordered the Dan Air flight to enter a holding pattern, to give the slower plane time to get out of the way. The holding pattern was based around the nearby Foxtrot Papa, or FP, beacon. The controller wanted the Boeing to head northwest out to sea, then circle back towards the airport. Once a turboprop plane had landed, it could then exit its holding pattern and land safely. The instructions from the controller were, "turn to the left," when in fact he meant to say "turns to the left," in reference to the intended direction of the holding pattern. Although given a heading of 150 degrees to approach the airport, the additional command to turn to the left confused the pilots, but they did not ask air traffic control to clarify the instructions. The pilots decided that once they had reached the beacon, they would turn left on a heading of 150 degrees, away from the airport. Meanwhile, at the airport, the turboprop had landed. Air traffic control, believing the Dan Air flight was still in its assigned holding pattern, instructed them to descend to 5,000 feet, which took them below the peak of La Esperanza, a fog-covered mountain just a short distance away. Just then, the ground proximity warning went off in the cockpit. Believing his left turn had led them toward the mountain, the captain instead turned hard to the right, instead of increasing power and ascending. This turn to the right cost the plane 300 feet of altitude, and then it was all over. 2 seconds after the co-pilot told air traffic control of their ground proximity warning, Dan Air Flight 1008 slammed into the side of La Esperanza, just 92 feet, 28 meters, below the summit. The impact obliterated most of the plane on impact. The tail section continued onward for several hundred meters before it hit the ground, plummeted into a ravine, and broke apart. Although nobody witnessed the impact, signs of a plane crash soon became apparent to people on the mountainside. Travel brochures and documents rained down on the village of Las Lagunetas, about 2 kilometers from the crash site. Within hours, rescuers had made their way to the crash site, but there were no survivors, and no complete human bodies. Most of the remains were never conclusively identified. Investigators from both Spain and Great Britain recovered the black boxes and began to investigate what happened. They were concerned about the high speed of the Dan Air flight that had made it almost overtake the turboprop plane in front of it. The controller then devised a holding pattern where they would turn right, but instead turn left towards the mountains. Investigators agreed that the confusion began when the controller said, quote, "The standard holding pattern overhead Foxtrot Papa is inbound heading 150, turn to the left." Clearly he meant turns to the left, but by omitting the S in turns, it had ended up as a command to turn left. Spanish investigators blamed the pilots, as they did not repeat the instructions back, as is normal. British investigators, however, said that was unfair, as the instructions were, quote, "so poorly worded." Either way, they did not ask for clarification. While both sets of investigators squabbled over who was to blame, they did not take into account the real problems. Although the inquiry into the 1977 disaster recommended the installation of radar at the airport, this had not been done. Neither runway at the airport had an instrument landing system, despite frequent cloud cover. Without this technology in place, there would be little to stop a pilot flying off course after miscommunication with the tower. A small memorial garden was set up in Manchester to commemorate the victims of the disaster.